Welcome, everybody. As you just heard, this meeting is being recorded, and I would request that, and you seem to all be muted, if you put yourselves on mute. And it'd be nice if you hit the picture so we can all see who you are, unless you're not dressed or in the middle of eating or something. And when it comes to the question time, I forgot to ask Jeremy about this. There's a couple ways we can handle that, either through chat or participants down below. You can raise your hand and ask a question. And if you want to field them directly, Jeremy, you may, or I can. Okay, that's what we'll do. So this is our 12th and hopefully our last Zoom meeting. February 2020, we did not meet due to inclement weather. And it wasn't until 6 months later that we actually held our first Zoom meeting in August, and this being our 12th one. Lily Watts, at the time, my granddaughter, who is present right now, was appointed the VP of IT. And if it wasn't for her, frankly, and our first speaker was Paul Eckine on the pandemic, I don't know if we would have had these Zoom meetings. So I've asked her if she would be here present also to conclude the last meeting, just because as I indicated earlier, I usually find some way to figure out how to botch these things up. So Lily, I don't know if you want to say a quick hello or just wave to everybody. Or...
Yeah, I can say, can everyone hear me? I'm also on a call, a real phone call with my grandfather right now. So.
But you are muted and not on the.
But there she is.
Yeah, I'm speaking through the phone right now, so we don't get feedback.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. So hopefully they heard that. I don't know. So I thought you might want to give a wave out, but that's okay.
She did earlier.
Okay, there you go. Thank you, Lily. All right. And so with that, I'd like to ask Bill Helm if he'd give us our words of inspiration. Bill?
Sure. Well, gentlemen, I'm going to offer a garden for 2021. Plant 3 rows of peas, peas of mind, peas of heart, and peas of soul. Plant 4 rows of squash, squash gossip, squash indifference, squash grumbling, squash selfishness. Plant 4 rows of lettuce. Let us be faithful, let us be kind, and let us be patient. Let us really love one another. To conclude our garden, we must have time. Time for each other, time for family, time for friends. And it's important, water freely with patience and cultivate with love.
Wow. Thanks a lot, Bill. That was really, really nice. Yeah. Quite imaginative too as well. Thank you. Next, I'd like to call on Paul Bidwell. If you're there, Paul, to introduce your guest today.
Here. Welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. George Sutherland has been a friend of mine for a long, long time. We started together at Connecticut General, now Cigna, in 1956 and have remained close friends ever since. Unlike me, George stayed with Cigna and was involved in almost all aspects of the company at one time or another. At his retirement, he was a member of the corporate staff. After retirement, he became a consultant to the Episcopal Diocese of Connecticut. He and Jean later moved to Eastman, where George over the years became heavily involved in Eastman affairs. He has been vice chairman of the Eastman Council, president of the board of directors, chairman of committees on environment and governance, and a member of the Eastman Charitable Foundation. In addition, he has also been heavily involved in Iliad, now Osher, having been a member of the curriculum planning, finance committees, and the executive council. He has also been a member of the standing committee for the Episcopal Diocese of New Hampshire. George has also been a member, George is a previous member of Squires but resigned during a period when he had other commitments. Please join me in welcoming George back to our group.
Got to send the link to yourself.
Thank you. George, would you like to say hello? You have to unmute yourself. George, unmute yourself and say, just say a
That's
quick
what I
hello.
did.
There you go.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Good to be here. Good to see you.
Good. Welcome, welcome aboard, George.
Thank you.
Glad to have you as a guest.
Thank you.
I'd like to now reintroduce again Bill
Send it to
Matson.
me or to you?
To me.
Is someone
You
else
said it to
talking?
yourself.
Said it wrong.
Someone is not muted? Okay.
Art.
I want to reintroduce my guest from last week, who is now our newest member, Bill Matson. So Bill, hello, welcome. And you want to just say a quick shout out?
It's good to be here and great to see George Sutherland rejoining the fold. He's the epitome of what you think about in terms of squires. So happy to be here.
Great. Great. With the addition of Bill, that brings the total number of members since we have been basically shut down to 21 new members, which I think I'm very pleased with. And it's through a lot of all your efforts, and it keeps I think we've got a real accurate handle on our total number of folks involved now. So thank you to all. So now I guess I'd like to introduce Art Rosen, who will be introducing our speaker today.
Oh, all right, good. Good to be with you again, Joe, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to introduce Jeremy DeSilva back to the Squires. Jeremy is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Dartmouth, and many of you will remember his talk in 2017 on human ancestors and recent findings in South Africa. Since then, among the many things he's done, has been edited a collection titled The Most Interesting Problem: What Darwin's Descent of Man Got Right and Wrong About Human Evolution. His talk today will outline key points from that collection. So we turn now to Jeremy DeSilva.
Thank you, Art. Thanks everyone for the invitation to speak with you all again. I'm coming from my lab at Dartmouth. It's good to be back here after several months of not being on campus very frequently at all. And so this is not some fancy background. This is my lab. I got all my friends back here, many of which I talked to you about in 2017. As Art mentioned, this year published through Princeton University Press, and what I'm going to speak about is a book on reflecting on our field, the state of our field, 150 years after Darwin published Descent of Man, and that's what I'll talk about today. I'll mention as well that I published another book that's on upright walking, the origins and evolution of upright walking, called First Steps, how upright walking made us human. So you'll see hints of that throughout this talk as well, since that's what I study. So I'm going to dive in. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this will work. All right. So does everyone see my screen? Thumbs up?
Yep.
Okay, good. All right. So in 1871, Charles Darwin published The Descent of Man. This was a follow-up to Origin of Species. Darwin is known mostly for The Origin of Species, which was the book in which he laid out the mechanism for evolution. Darwin did not invent evolution. People had been thinking about species changing for a long time. What Darwin did was he was able to collect the evidence and formulate a hypothesis for the mechanism of evolutionary change. How do species change over time? And he called that natural selection. And so that was his great contribution to science, was the discovery of, really the co-discovery of natural selection, or evolution by means of natural selection, which he published in The Origin of Species. I say co-discoverer because there was another scholar who had been working in Indonesia by the name of Alfred Russel Wallace, who came up with the exact same idea. And they actually announced it together in 1858. And you'll hear more about Alfred Russel Wallace later in this talk. He and Darwin ended up communicating with each other quite a bit over the next 25 years or so, including what Darwin referred to as a most interesting problem for the naturalist. And that was the question of human origins. Because in The Origin of Species, Darwin said almost nothing about humans. He talked about all sorts of other animals, but he didn't really tackle the origin of humans. But 12 years later, in 1871, with The Descent of Man, he hits it head on. He tackles this question of where did humans come from? Okay, that's 1871. Now it's 2021, 150 years have passed. And I'm somebody who loves anniversaries. I love, you know, 100-year mark or 50-year mark. You know, when I get to celebrate with my wife at our, I guess the next one will be our 17th wedding anniversary. I love those moments where you get to sort of reflect back on what has happened in that time frame. And so with the 150-year anniversary of Darwin's Descent of Man approaching, I saw this as an opportunity to get a bunch of my colleagues together to reflect back on this, this very influential book that Darwin wrote, and what did he get right and what did he get wrong? Because, you know, Darwin is not somebody that we worship. He was a scientist. He had ideas. Some of those ideas have withstood the test of time with the evidence that we currently have, and some have not. So I saw this as a really good opportunity for us to see what kind of progress we've made since Darwin's time. Now, a little bit about me. I am not a historian, and so we brought on a historian to work on this project. I am a paleoanthropologist, so I study the human fossil record. So that's the paleo part of paleoanthropology. And I'm an anthropologist. I study humans. So that's why I'm surrounded by human fossils. And I'll note that none of them existed in Darwin's time. He didn't know about any of these fossils at all. DNA is not something that had been discovered. We'll get into that in just a bit. And so Darwin had a lot less material to work with. Now, I started in on this project to critique Darwin's findings and realized I couldn't do it alone. So what I ended up doing was reaching out to colleagues of mine, and each one took a separate chapter in Darwin's Descent of Man. And that's how I'm going to give my talk today, is through these different chapters that we tackled. The first one, which is just the preface, belongs to me. And I got to write the first word. And what I chose to write about was this fossil that's on the screen right now and in my hand. This is a replica of this fossil. This is the only human fossil that Charles Darwin ever held in his hand. And he held it in his hands in 1864. And it was when he visited London. He spent most of his time after he traveled the world on the Beagle. He spent most of his remaining years in the Down House, which is just south of London. It's a really beautiful property. If anyone has a chance to go there, I would highly recommend it. Beautiful property. And that's where he did most of his writing after he had collected all of his data through his Beagle voyage and subsequent research communications that he would have with scientists and observers around the world. But Darwin was quite ill. Darwin suffered from a number of maladies, many of which have not been identified. We're not sure what Darwin had, whether he caught something while he was traveling the world, whether he had, some have argued he might have been lactose intolerant, might have been something as simple as that. What's clear in his writings is that he suffered from anxiety, and that he would often have these long periods of of abdominal discomfort, headaches, vomiting. He was not a well man. And in 1864, he traveled to London to spend some time with his wife's sister, Sarah Wedgwood, at her property in London. And when he was there, a Scottish paleontologist by the name of Hugh Falconer brought him this skull, this extraordinary skull that had been discovered in Gibraltar. And it was found there, and researchers didn't really know, scientists didn't know what to make of it. And in 1864, there was a scientific conference, and Hugh Falconer was going to present the fossils that had been found at Gibraltar, including this skull. And he brought it to Darwin. Now, this is before he published Descent of Man. And you would think that seeing an ancient human skull with characteristics that are different from what you see in a human skull today. The eyes are much bigger. There's not much of a forehead on this individual. The nose is much larger than on a typical human skull. You would think that Darwin would have seen this skull and been amazed by it and made drawings and written notes and incorporated it into his book on human evolution. And he didn't. The only reference he makes to this skull in all of his writings is a single line that's in a letter that's replicated here to his friend J.D. Hooker, in which he says at the very bottom here, both Lyell and Falconer, here he's referring to the geologist Charles Lyell, Lyell and Falconer called on me and I was very glad to see them. F, meaning Falconer, brought me the wonderful Gibraltar skull. Farewell, ever yours, Charles Darwin. That's it. That's all he says about a skull that we now know is 50,000 years old and belonged to a female Neanderthal. So he held in his hand the skull of a Neanderthal, and he didn't know it. He didn't recognize it at the time. And so this is the only point in the talk where I want to read something from the book. And it kind of sets the stage for what we had hoped to accomplish with this book. Okay, so here goes. Science is done by scientists. Even the very best scientists in the world, in this case, Charles Darwin himself, make mistakes. Sometimes these errors are rooted in bias. Sometimes they arise from insufficient data to answer the question being asked. And sometimes they happen because an illness compromises focus when a friend visits with an ancient fossil skull one summer day in 1864. Figuring out how the natural world works is not easy. Fossils do not come with labels. It took the discovery of many more fossils in the late 19th and early 20th centuries for scientists to recognize the legitimacy of Neanderthals. Even then, it was not until DNA was extracted from these old bones that we began to truly understand the role of Neanderthals in human evolution. And today we still have many unanswered questions about our extinct cousins. The inner workings of the natural world do not magically reveal themselves. Data never speak for themselves. Instead, interpretations of evidence are made by people who breathe meaning into empirically derived facts and figures. And scientific hypotheses are not always self-evident. They are generated in creative minds and tested by emotional, subjective human beings behaving as objectively as they can. Science is thus a human endeavor. Sometimes the humanity of science leads to great insights, but sometimes it leads to a scientist holding the evidence for a human past literally in his hands without recognizing it. That is why science cannot be done in isolation by a single individual. It is a collective enterprise that unfolds over generations as we test and retest old ideas and develop new ones to make sense of our world. It stagnates when it is done by homogeneous scientists with similar backgrounds and experiences. It outright fails when it is practiced by inflexible individuals clinging desperately to tired ideas. Darwin knew this. He wrote, quote, "I had during my many years followed a golden rule, namely that whenever published fact, a new observation of thought came across me, which was opposed to my general results, to make a memorandum of it without fail and at once. For I had found by experience that such facts and thoughts were far more apt to escape from the memory than favorable ones." While many of us scientists admire Darwin, we do not worship him. He was a brilliant scholar who not only generated new data, but could see how his observations were connected under big overarching ideas with both explanatory and predictive power. He navigated seamlessly between big picture theory level thinking and the small intricate details. In studying orchids, earthworms, and barnacles, he could see both the forest and the trees. But Darwin had flaws, both as a scientist and as a human. So that is sort of sets up, the gist of the book. And now I'm going to take you chapter by chapter how we dissected Descent of Man. And my hope would be that if somehow Darwin could see what we were doing, he'd be thrilled by it. He'd be thrilled by all the great discoveries that we've made. So we started off after my preface with the Harvard historian Janet Brown, who's written the biographies on Darwin. If anyone is sort of interested in learning more about Charles Darwin, this is where you should start, is with Janet Brown's biographies, Voyaging, which is the first part of his life, and then The Power of Place, the second half of his life, including the writing of Origin of Species and Descent of Man. Now, in the Descent of Man, it's when Darwin uses the word evolution for the first time. The Origin of Species, 1859, he never uses the word evolution. Evolution appears in his writing for the first time 12 years later on page 2 of The Descent of Man. It's also the first time that the term survival of the fittest is used by Darwin. That was not in Origin of Species. That is a term that was developed by a man named Herbert Spencer, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But Darwin adopted it for Descent of Man, and it appears in a later chapter. Janet Brown in the introduction does a wonderful job of framing historically what the world was like when Darwin was writing this book, especially Victorian era England, when Darwin was writing, and what the response was to Descent of Man. As you can imagine, by this point, Darwin was quite the celebrity, and his book made a huge splash. It was lampooned by many individuals. He himself said, "I shall be well abused," when he turned in this book to his publisher, knowing that he had avoided the subject of human evolution in Origin of Species, and now he was taking on this incredibly controversial subject. The book was sent to a reviewer at the Quarterly Review, who said, quote, "The arguments in these sheets you have sent me appear to be little better than drivel." And so he definitely got some tough reception from some folks. But again, 150 years later, it's still a book that has some extraordinary insights in it. In chapter 1 of Descent of Man, Charles Darwin lays out the argument that humans have a past. What he says in chapter 1 is the sole object of this work is to consider, firstly, whether man, like every other species, is descended from some pre-existing form. And he calls the chapter The Evidence of Descent of Man from Some Lower Form. Now, we asked a professor in England, who's an anatomist and an anthropologist, Alice Roberts, to write this chapter, reflecting on what Darwin knew at the time. And it's brilliant. It's an absolutely brilliant chapter. Now, today, when I teach my students about evolution, I spend a lot of time on fossils and I spend a lot of time on DNA. And those were not available to Darwin at this time. The fossils were far and few between, or not recognized as important, and DNA had not been discovered yet. And so what Darwin leaned on was his understanding of embryology and comparative anatomy. And so in this chapter, Alice Roberts talks a lot about what we now understand about embryology and how during the stages of development, a human embryo passes through many of the same stages that you see in lots of other organisms as well. At some point, we have gill slits. At some point, we have a tail. There's a term known as phylogeny or ontogeny, recapitulating phylogeny. That's not quite how we understand it today. It's a little more nuanced than that. And yet we do see similarities in developmental form. Darwin also writes a lot about comparative anatomy. And so the bones found in the upper limb of a human or a horse or even a whale or an amphibian or a reptile like a turtle or a feathered reptile like a bird, these are all homologous structures. And so you can identify a humerus, you can identify a radius and an ulna, because those are bones that are shared amongst a wide group of organisms because they share common ancestry and have inherited those forms through time with subtle modifications depending on the regional adaptations and ecological adaptations that those lineages have. So that's what Darwin understood at the time, was this comparative anatomy. We now can do this on a genetic level. And so Alice Roberts talks about homologous gene structures. And so, for instance, there's a series of genes, developmental genes known as Hox genes, that pattern the body during development. Why is a head here and a tail down there, whether you are a dog, a cat, a human, or even an insect? There's a body plan where there's a head and a tail. And this follows the sequence of genes called Hox genes that are shared in common by all organisms, invertebrate or vertebrate. All animals have these Hox genes. There can be duplicates of Hox genes. So while fruit flies, for instance, have just a single sequence of Hox genes, humans have 4 series of Hox genes duplicated on their chromosomes, as do mice and other mammals. Darwin talks a lot too about vestigial structures and evidence for a past because we have things that are no longer needed. For instance, the appendix, or he talks about the tailbone, the coccyx, which is the remnant of a primate ancestry in which we would have had tails. There's even a little lip that you can check out on yourself and see if you have on the inside of your ear that's been named after Darwin. It's called Darwin's tubercle. And it's thought to be a remnant or a vestigial structure from our primate ancestry. Goosebumps are also thought to be related to what's called piloerection, or standing up of the hair that you see in some mammals, like cats do it and primates will do it. Whales still have little leg bones, vestigial leg bones. Even blind cavefish still have eyes because their ancestors did. But what Alice Roberts takes us into in this chapter is evidence for vestigial genetic structures, pseudogenes we call them. And a great example is the gene to produce vitamin C. And so, I tell my kids all the time that they need to eat their fruits and vegetables, and yet my dog doesn't need to. And let's see, a dolphin doesn't need to eat fruit, and it still does just fine. So where is the vitamin C coming from? Well, the vitamin C is made by the organism. It can be manufactured in most mammals. They don't have to ingest it. But in primates, there was a mutation. And that mutation, which happened on chromosome 8, there was a mutation that rendered that gene useless. And it no longer helps us make vitamin C. So we have to eat it. And that's true of all primates that we're closely related to. Chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, gibbons, the old world monkeys, the new world monkeys, and a little primate called a tarsier. None of them can make vitamin C. And so what do we know about monkeys and apes? They love fruit. They eat a whole lot of fruit. They eat bananas and whatever other fruit that they can get their hands on because they have to. But what's really cool is if you look at chromosome 8 in the human genome, we still have that gene. It's still there. It's just not working. It's a broken gene. So that's a vestigial gene that's still there, an echo of our evolutionary past. In chapter 2, one of the great mysteries to me was why Darwin established the evidence of our ancestry and then went straight to the brain. The brain is one of these amazing human structures that has puzzled people for generations. And instead of waiting till the end to address the brain, Darwin hit it head on, chapters 2 and 3, in chapters that he calls Comparison of the Mental Powers of Man and the Lower Animals. And what Darwin argues in his chapter, he says, my object in this chapter is solely to show that there is no fundamental difference between man and higher mammals in their mental faculties. That's a huge statement. That's a remarkable statement, given what we know about humans in comparison to other animals. What Darwin really championed is that the differences between humans and other animals are just differences in extent, not differences in kind. This chapter was brilliantly written by Susanna Herculano-Huzel, who's a neurobiologist at the University of Vanderbilt. And I have a picture here next to her of Alfred Russel Wallace, who I mentioned earlier. Wallace was the co-discoverer of natural selection with Darwin. He just didn't write a book like Darwin did, and so he's not as well known. But Wallace did tackle the subject of human evolution before Darwin did. And in 1869, he wrote about human evolution and said humans can be understood through natural selection, except the brain. He said the brain it cannot be understood through that mechanism. There has to be another way to understand it. And he was leaning towards more of a supernatural explanation when it comes to our brain function. And Darwin's response to Wallace upon reading his work was, I hope you have not murdered too completely your own and my child. And by that, he meant natural selection. Because Darwin thought you can explain the brain through natural selection. And he told Wallace that. And Wallace's response, I love this is sort of that collegial back and forth. Wallace's response was, I look forward with fear and trembling to being crushed under a mountain of evidence. And because he knew that Darwin was working on this huge book about human evolution. So what do we know today about brain evolution? We know a lot. And we know that indeed the human brain is an expanded primate brain. It has all of the same parts that you see in the brain of other mammals, in the brain of other primates. It's just larger with more neurons and more connections. The different parts have been understood by examining comparative neuroanatomy in monkeys at the top here. We've got apes down towards the bottom, chimpanzees, bonobos, and of course, the human brain, which is a remarkable structure. It is a magnificent structure, but it is not, again, different in kind. It is different simply in extent. Now, our brain is 3 times larger than the brain of our closest living ape relatives, the chimpanzee. So do we have any evidence for those intermediates? And the answer is a resounding yes. So across the x-axis here is time in millions of years, going back to about 4 million years ago. And across the y-axis is brain size. And what I've done is I've noted at the bottom here, the average chimpanzee brain size down here, okay? And then this is where, with the yellow line, that's the average human brain today, right there. And every dot represents a fossil that we found. We literally have hundreds of fossils that represent all of those transitional brain sizes between an ancient ancestor that had a brain slightly larger than a chimpanzee's, right up through the origin of genus Homo, right up through Homo erectus, right up to Homo sapiens. And Neanderthals are in here as well with their enlarged brains. And so we've learned a lot about brain evolution. Darwin didn't know about this at the time of his writing, and he would have been thrilled by all these great discoveries. In chapter 3, Darwin begins to connect brain anatomy to behavior. And he takes on the topics of reasoning and sympathy and spirituality and morality and regret and even love. And again, these are topics that you would think would be kind of outside of the realm of a scientist at that time, but he tackles these in an absolutely magnificent and elegant way that connect us to the living world in ways that I think, 150 years later, we're just rediscovering. What he said was, any animal whatsoever endowed with well-marked social instincts would inevitably acquire a moral sense of conscience as soon as its intellectual powers become as well or nearly as well developed as in man. We often think about Darwinism as about competition. And in this chapter, Darwin talks about cooperation and sociality and social animals like dogs and wolves and insects that are incredibly cooperative with each other. This is a chapter that is explored by Duke University anthropologist Brian Hare. Brian has spent a career studying bonobos, who are our close primate relatives that live in the Congo, and Darwin didn't even know they existed. They weren't discovered by science until 1933, long after Darwin's death. And Brian Hare studies another social animal, the dog. And I'll tell you quickly a quick story about injustice and right and wrong, and experiments that have been done on this particular primate. This is a monkey called a capuchin. This is work that was championed by Franz de Waal, who's a primatologist at Emory University. And it goes like this. These capuchins were in a laboratory facility And they were taught the concept of currency. They were taught that they had these little coins and they could trade in a plastic coin, a useless plastic coin. You can't eat it, useless plastic coin for food. And food is pretty useful. So the researcher would come by and the monkey would stick a coin out of the cage and the researcher would give that monkey a cucumber and they'd eat the cucumber. And sometimes the researcher would take the coin and give the monkey a grape. And they'd get really excited when they get grapes. They love, love, love grapes. Okay, so here's the experiment. You have a researcher come into the laboratory and a monkey holds out a coin and you give the monkey a cucumber. You give the next monkey a cucumber when they give you the coin. Everyone's happy. That's your control. Now you do the experiment again. And the first monkey sticks out the coin. You take the coin, you give it a grape. Second monkey, you give it a cucumber. That monkey, instead of just eating the cucumber, which is what it should do, a rational thinking creature should simply say, I got food for a plastic coin. It doesn't. It throws the cucumber on the ground and throws a tantrum. It wanted a grape because it saw that other monkey got a grape. And I have a couple of kids at home. I can hear this. That's not fair. That's not fair. He got a grape. Why didn't I get a grape? So this sense of injustice, this sort of right and wrong, the basis of morality, we are seeing in some of our primate cousins and in the behavior of our primate cousins. These experiments have been done with chimpanzees and bonobos as well. And chimpanzees don't mind as much if the chimpanzee next to them is a friend or a chimpanzee that they're related to. Bonobos seem to be happy that anyone gets a grape. They seem to be pretty social and happy about that. So we're seeing through these experiments with these animals, what's going on in their minds, which is a really remarkable thing that I think Darwin would absolutely celebrate. In chapter 4, Darwin dives into the ancestry of humans, again, without a fossil record. Now, he had access to that Neanderthal skull, but he didn't really recognize what he had at the time. He called his chapter on the manner of development of man from some lower form. And this is a chapter that was written by Johannes Haile Selassie, who's one of the best paleoanthropologists in the world. He works at Arizona State University. He's the head of the Institute for Human Origins. He was born and raised in Ethiopia, and that's where he does most of his work, is in Ethiopia, finding extraordinary fossils of our ancestors. Now, Johannes was the right choice for this chapter, not only because he's an incredible anthropologist and fossil discoverer, but also because Charles Darwin predicted in Descent of Man, without any evidence, he predicted that it is somewhat more probable that our early progenitors lived on the African continent than elsewhere. Now, there were researchers saying that human evolution unfolded in Asia. There was some saying it happened in Europe. And Darwin said, I don't think so. I think it was Africa. Now, how do we know? Well, we got to test it. We got to go find some fossils. And the very first fossil discovered in Africa was discovered 50 years after Darwin wrote Descent of Man. He had already died, so Darwin didn't live long enough to see his predictions come true. It was a fossil that was discovered exactly 100 years ago, this June. So that anniversary just came and went. And it was a fossil found accidentally during a mining operation in a cave in Zambia, discovered by a Zambian boy whose name was never recorded. But this guy, who is the individual who is there, is a Swiss miner by the name of Tom Zwiglar, is often given credit. But he really was the second person to hold that skull. It is a remarkable skull, but it was dismissed at the time as a pathological modern person and not an ancient human. We know now that this skull is 300,000 years old. It was only a couple of years later that a man named Raymond Dart, working with cave debris that came from a cave known as Taung, discovered evidence for our ancestry in Africa, the very first Australopithecus fossil. You may know of a famous Australopithecus by the name of Lucy. And when I talked to you back in 2017, I talked a lot about Australopithecus. Since that time, we have literally found thousands of fossils of early human ancestors, thousands of them. And with these fossils, we've been able to test some of Darwin's predictions. Darwin looked at humans and he looked at apes and he said, okay, we differ from them in having a larger brain. We walk on two legs rather than on our knuckles. We make sophisticated tools, and we have these tiny canine teeth, whereas apes have big fangs. And Darwin saw all of those features evolving in concert. He argued that early humans stood on two legs, and that freed the hands for tools. And if you're making tools, then you don't need big fangs to rip apart, meat if you're eating animals, if you're hunting, and that technology is being fed by an enlarged brain. So he's seeing these things happen in concert. And with fossils, we can actually test if that's the case, and it's not. He was totally wrong about this. And again, that's okay. He didn't have any fossils. What we know is that upright walking and canine reduction happened first. The earliest members of our lineage, the oldest fossils we have, are moving around on two legs, not exactly like us, but a lot like us. And a little bit later, we find smaller and smaller canines, but brains are still tiny, and there's no evidence for stone tool technology. These are fossils that are 7 million, 6 million, 5 million years old. By about 3 million years, we start to find stone tools. So 4 million years have passed with an upright walking ancestor of ours, and then they start making stone tools. It's not until 2 million years ago that we start seeing that increase in brain size, as I showed you earlier. And so Darwin got the order of this wrong, but that's okay. He didn't have the evidence. So Darwin presented these testable hypotheses, and with the fossil record, we can now test his ideas. I'm gonna skip ahead because I just summarized all that in that slide. Now, why did humans start walking on two legs? Darwin had an idea. He said, if it be an advantage to man to have his hands and arms free and to stand firmly on his feet, of which there can be no doubt from his preeminent success in the battle of life, then I can see no reason why it should not have been advantageous to have the progenitors of man to become more and more erect or bipedal. They would thus have been better able to defend themselves with stones or clubs, or to have attacked their prey or otherwise obtain food. Okay, this idea, which now is known as man the hunter, was really championed by that scientist who found that first Australopithecus fossil, Raymond Dart. And then it was popularized in a best-selling book by Robert Ardrey in the 1960s, known as African Genesis. And hopefully some of you will recognize this scene from 2001, A Space Odyssey. This is the opening scene of Stanley Kubrick or Arthur C. Clarke's brilliant movie from, adaptation from Arthur C. Clarke's book. It's the Dawn of Man sequence. Why did humans start walking on two legs? It's because we were violent and we freed our hands to destroy things. The fossil evidence doesn't support this at all, whatsoever. In fact, what it shows instead is that we were the ones being predated upon. Lots and lots and lots of fossils of ancient human ancestors being consumed by leopards, not fossils of things that we were attacking and consuming. That happens later with Homo erectus 2 million years ago, but back at the origin, absolutely not. In fact, what we find instead is more evidence for cooperation rather than competition. Again, something I think Darwin would be quite interested in as the roots of our lineage being social roots rather than selfish roots. Now, in chapter 5, Darwin takes chronologically carries on, but in terms of his approach, he really veers off course. This is a chapter called On the Development of the Intellectual and Moral Faculties During Primeval and Civilized Times. This is a chapter where Darwin starts to go off the rails a little bit and make some suggestions and say some things that today are disturbing or have had disturbing outcomes. Christina Kilgrove, who is a bioarchaeologist at the University of North Carolina, took on this chapter, which is a difficult one to read and a difficult one to interpret 150 years later. Darwin essentially was equating biological evolution with cultural evolution, which is a mistake. He was trying to understand what he called the transition from savagery to barbarism to civilization. He was making this interpretation in the context of being a white man in Victorian England during the height of the British Empire, where a lot of colonialism was taking place. And what he put down on paper, some have interpreted as an explanation for Britain's rule, and some have interpreted as a justification for it. Where I think Darwin erred was that instead of tree thinking, and I'll explain that in a second, he started to think in a ladder-like progressional fashion, which was unlike him. So some of the words in this chapter were out of character. One of the things that he said, this is an image here, wood carving of an individual in the tip of South America, the Fuegan individual. He said, the astonishment which I felt on first seeing a party of Fuegans on a wild and broken shore will never be forgotten. At once, what rushed to my mind was that such were our ancestors. Now, these are people living today. And Darwin made the argument that you shouldn't treat things living today as your ancestors. These are your relatives. These are things living today. He even said later in the book, we must not fall into the error of supposing that the early progenitor of the whole simian stock, that means monkeys and apes, including man, was identical with or even closely resembled any existing ape or monkey. So why would you look at any existing human and think that you could use them as some time machine? And that's exactly what he did in this chapter. So Darwin went from this tree thinking, which was new, this was revolutionary, this was a new concept, that instead of things living today being arranged on a hierarchy, everything living today is equally evolved and shares ancestry through time. And that's where that branching tree comes from. He goes from this kind of thinking to this kind of thinking, where humans are on a single path, and what is the culminating appearance of the human form? It's a white male. And so that comes up over and over again in this chapter and in a couple of later chapters. Now, what is the context in which he's writing? It's the British Empire, right? He's writing as a member of, as an Englishman during the height of the British Empire. He even wrote that when civilized nations come into contact with barbarians, the struggle is short. The grade of civilization seems the most important element in the success of nations. So he's taking biological evolution and using it to explain why the British Empire is so successful, which has its pitfalls, honestly. One of the other things he says in this chapter is with savages, the weak in mind or in body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. With civilized men, by that he means Europeans, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. There is reason to believe that vaccination has preserved thousands who from a weak constitution would formerly have succumbed to smallpox. Thus, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. Excepting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone who is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. Now, Darwin never advocated for eugenics. In fact, the idea of eugenics was brought up by his cousin, Francis Galton, who was an absolutely brilliant man, but became the father of a disturbing movement that then impacted greatly the awful happenings of the 20th century, leading up to World War II and the Holocaust. What Darwin referred to in this passage, he called it the downward tendency of civilized nations. He says that if inferior members of society should be prevented from increasing at a quicker rate than the better class of man. Now, again, he was not advocating for eugenics, but people have taken those words and they have applied them in that context. So he laid the foundation for some of the arguments that were used later, awful arguments that were used later for genocide against humans. Now, I think Darwin himself, knowing what I know about him, again, I'm not a historian, but knowing what I know, I think he would be horrified by that, by the application of this information. But his words had power, and they continue to have power, and have been used, frankly, as of late, they continue to be used by white supremacists in this country. And this is the chapter that they often pull from. He gets back on track in chapter 6, after being a little derailed there in chapter 5, in a chapter on the affinities and genealogy of man. He goes back to tree thinking, which is amazing to me that he's able to disconnect himself from that when talking about humans living today. This is a chapter written by John Hawkes, who's at the University of Wisconsin. And one of the great quotes that Darwin ever said in the context of how do we classify humans? What are they? Darwin said, if man had not been his own classifier, he would never have thought of founding a separate order for his own reception. Because some researchers were saying, we're so different, we're not even primates, we're in our own order. And Darwin said, that is nonsense. We are primates, and not only that, but we're closely related to apes. Now, Darwin had horrible handwriting, so you can rarely read, but this is what he wrote. This is one of his trees of life. But as it pertains to humans, where do humans fit? We have decoded this, and this is what it looks like. He has humans as closely related to the other great apes, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, gibbons. Gibbons are what we call lesser ape. And then branching off there, he has monkeys from Asia and Africa, what we would call the cercopithecoid monkeys. And then branching off would be a lineage going to the South and Central American monkeys, what we'd call platyrrhines. And then he has a little branch going off to the lemurs, and that's the primate family tree. It is stunningly accurate. So now with genetic information, we can compare his tree to what we know now. And again, it is remarkably accurate. And the only change is that humans are more closely related to chimpanzees than they are to these other apes. So humans would be even more nested within that ape clade. So if I can draw your attention to humans, this little line here, that there would be humans, and then coming off would be the chimpanzees, and coming off next would be the gorillas, and then you would have the orangutans, and those would be the great apes. But the general structure of his family tree was remarkably similar to what we understand today. Now, what's interesting is in those 3 years, from 1868 when he did this tree to 1871 when he published Descent of Man, he changed his mind in who he thought was related to humans. In this previous tree, he had humans equally related to chimps, gorillas, and orangutans. But he changed his mind in those 3 years, and I don't know why. I still don't know why. He said in Descent of Man, it is therefore probable that Africa was formerly inhabited by extinct apes closely allied to the gorilla and the chimpanzee. These two species are now man's nearest allies. So he had humans closely related to the African great apes, which then follows why he would predict the earliest fossils would be found in Africa. And guess what? He's spot on. He was absolutely right. We now know from the sequencing of the entire genomes of humans, chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans, and gorillas that indeed humans, so here we are very closely related to, we are sister taxa to the chimpanzees and bonobos, and collectively that group is related to the gorillas, and collectively all of the African apes are equally related to the orangutan. And that's how the great apes are related to each other. We can even use genetic information to then estimate common ancestry and then test that with fossils. And so we know that humans are embedded within this great ape family tree, and the common ancestor we share with those other apes lived in Africa between 6 and around 10 million years ago. And we can find fossils with fossils that indeed confirm that. So the first 6 chapters of Descent of Man are absolutely fascinating. In chapter 7, he starts to get into the biological diversity of humans. And he has a chapter called On the Races of Man. Now, Darwin was an abolitionist. Okay, Darwin absolutely loathed the idea of slavery. This was influenced heavily by his own experiences when he was traveling on the Beagle around the world. There is a book that's been written by Adrian Desmond and James Moore called Darwin's Sacred Cause that I would highly recommend if you're interested in this idea. At the time that Darwin wrote Descent of Man, there was another idea out there about humans, that the different races of humans actually descended from different primate species, that we were not one species, that the different races were different species. It's called polygenesis, poly for many, genesis for origin, that humans have many origins. And this was championed by a Harvard University professor, so it had great weight, a guy by the name of Louis Agassiz. He spent a lot of time in the southern states, in the Confederacy, giving lectures. And those lectures were interpreted by politicians and by slave owners as justification for the maintenance of enslaved people in the Americas at that time. Darwin countered this. In Descent of Man, he laid out a whole series of arguments that we are one species, something called monogenesis, and really went at Agassiz's ideas. And so Darwin was an abolitionist. Darwin argued that we were a single species, but he also, in his writing, has some language that is unfavorable to people, especially of sub-Saharan ancestry. He wrote that the American Aborigines, Negroes, and Europeans differ as much from each other in mind as any three races that can be named. Yet I was incessantly struck while living with the Fuegians on board the Beagle, with the many little traits of character, showing how similar their minds were to ours. And so it was with a full-blooded Negro with whom I happened once to be intimate. What he means here is that when he was in Edinburgh learning how to do taxidermy, he was trained by a freed, formerly enslaved man by the name of John Edmonston. And John Edmonston greatly influenced Darwin's, well, he taught him how to do taxidermy. And then he was greatly influenced by, supposedly, by Edmonston's stories of South America. And Darwin was quite interested in visiting as a result. Now, in Descent of Man, Darwin tries to explain the different appearances of humans around the world, especially when it comes to the characteristic that humans seem to key in on when we want to categorize people, and that is skin coloration, the amount of melanin that you happen to have in your skin. And what Darwin wrote was, of all the differences between the races of man, the color of the skin is the most conspicuous and one of the best marked. Differences of this kind, it was formerly thought, could be accounted for by long exposure under different climates. This view has been rejected chiefly because the distribution of the various colored races, most of whom must have long inhabited their present homes, does not coincide with the corresponding differences of climate. We know now that Darwin was off here, that melanin concentration, that skin coloration of people around the world tracks beautifully with ultraviolet radiation. And it is an elegant tug of war between vitamin D production, which requires UV light, and folic acid protection, which requires protection against UV light. And so if you are dark-skinned close to the equator where there's lots of UV radiation, then there's so much UV radiation you can make enough vitamin D, and there is enough melanin to protect you against folic acid destruction. If you're light-skinned, however, you have a greater tendency to have folic acid destruction and a greater risk of having a child with spina bifida. Now, spina bifida can be treated today, but millions of years ago, thousands of years ago, not so much. Likewise, if you are darker skinned, farther from the equator, you have a vitamin D production problem. And so humans are all brown. We're all different shades of brown. Some are so light brown that they appear white or pink, and some are so dark brown that they appear almost a blackish color. But it is a continuum. You cannot divide humans up into discrete categories with clear breaks. And that's true genetically as well. So there was a study that was done looking at the genetic patterning of humans in different regions of the world. So here are Europeans right there, here are Asians right here, Africans, and you may say, oh, look, they break up into these different discrete categories. Well, that happens if you ignore the billion people who live in India. Once you do that, once you incorporate their data in, then there is no clean break between people in Europe and people in Asia. It is a continuum. And likewise, if you could include people from the Middle East, you would see that there's no, or from Northern Africa, that there's no break between sub-Saharan Africans, Europeans, and Asians as well. So on the bottom here, this is probably the most important graph that I can show you today. This is a patterning of genetic differences between humans on Earth, different populations of humans on Earth, okay? Where are the races? Where are the clear breaks between people? They're not there. So any categorization of humans into discrete categories we call races is arbitrary. And if it's arbitrary, then it's non-scientific. So scientists in my field, biological anthropology, geneticists, have rejected the concept of race. That the concept of race is a social construct. It's something, it's real politically, it's real socially. Racism is very real. But in terms of biology, race itself is not a good way to break up humans into different categories. It's not what we see in the data. It's not the patterning we see in the data. Darwin had an inkling about this. He said in that chapter, we have thus far been baffled in all our attempts to account for the differences between the races of man. But he was unable to take that next step and say, and it's because those races are not entirely real, that they're actually socially constructed. Okay, I'm gonna jump ahead because I'm running out of time. Descent of Man was 2 books. It was actually 2 books, and one of those books was about his other great idea, sexual selection. Darwin said once, the sight of a feather in a peacock's tail whenever I gaze at it makes me sick. And it's because his grand idea of natural selection doesn't explain a peacock's tail. That tail doesn't make you fly any better, and it doesn't make you avoid predation. Tigers will eat peacocks. So how in the world does a peacock's, the male, how does his plumage evolve? And it's because of the female's interest in that kind of plumage. She finds him attractive because look, if he has that kind of plumage in an area with lots and lots of predators, if he's able to devote all that energy to that plumage, then he must be something special. And so she's interested in mating with him. And so Darwin in chapters 8 through 18 writes about this other grand idea of sexual selection. So Darwin not only came up with natural selection, but sexual selection. And sexual selection has been used for 150 years to help us explain what we call dimorphism, differences in size, differences in coloration, differences in behavior between the males and the females of a particular species. So it's an elegant idea. It's still something we're learning about. Where Darwin had some missteps was when he came back to humans and applied sexual selection to humans. This is a chapter that was written by Holly Dunsworth. She's a professor at the University of Rhode Island, and she found it to be a very difficult chapter to write because she looked up to Darwin, and then in his writings, she found words like, man is more courageous, pugnacious, and energetic than woman, and has a more inventive genius. It was hard for her to read just how dismissive he was of women. In the bottom right is an image of Henrietta Darwin. That's Darwin's daughter. She edited Descent of Man. She was his editor. So he trusted her enough to read these pages and to make markings and to make suggestions. But then in that same book, to talk about the fact that women were inferior to men. He went off the rails in this chapter. In fact, I think these chapters are some of the worst writings that Darwin ever did, in a book where I find some of the more brilliant writings he ever came up with as well. So it's a complicated book. He's a complicated figure. Everything I've read about him and his wife Emma, they had a lovely marriage. He was a devoted husband. He was a wonderful dad. And yet in those pages, he talks about the strongest and boldest men in contest tests for wives. It's the same language that you see today in Cosmo magazines and Men's Health magazines that promote ideas that really are not consistent with the evidence that we have about human behavior. The last thing I'll mention about this is that some people have said, well, Darwin was a product of his time. And that's true. But at his time was a woman named Antoinette Brown Blackwell, who was the first ordained Protestant minister. She wrote 2 books. She said that the sexes in each species of being are always true equivalents, equals but not identical. She sent Darwin a copy of one of her books, and he wrote back to her, "Dear Sir," and then followed up with his response. I don't know why. I fear, or I suspect, it was simply because he couldn't imagine that a woman had written the book. So he was operating from a real bias, a position of bias, which I celebrate Darwin for his ability to look outside those biases and to come up with ideas that were outside the box. He did so frequently. But bias is a powerful thing. And when it came to sex differences and races, he couldn't quite think outside that box. And so it's an important lesson, I think, for all of us and all of us as scientists, that as objective as we try to be, we have our biases. And we have to always think about that as we're doing our work. The last chapter was brilliantly done by Ann Gibbons, and she imagined Darwin sitting down for dinner in his lovely dining room with modern scientists, men, women, people of all sorts of different backgrounds from all over the world, sharing with him what we've learned in the 150 years and how his words have inspired the work that we continue to do today. So it was a really fun book. It was a really fun project. I'm sorry I talked for as long as I did. I wanted to have some time for questions. I hope there still is. There's a lot more in this book. Please check it out. And then if you're interested in anything having to do with upright walking, which I'm happy to talk about as well, I also wrote this other book, First Steps, and can chat about that at any point.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. That was quite a presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Do we have any questions?
Let's see, gallery view.
Let's see.
So I see Martha asking in the chat, is it merely by chance that
Other
some
questions
vestigial
about
organ
Zoom
like the
meetings?
intestinal appendix?
Are there any questions for Jeremy out there? You can either go on the participants or just chat, or if you want to raise your hands.
This is Martha. At least it's her computer because mine wasn't working properly. I had written you as to how you explain in your fantastic lecture, how you explain the differences between some vestigial organs, such as our intestinal appendices, and other organs which would have remained vestigial, but they disappeared, such as our change to the canine teeth that you mentioned. Thoughts about that, please?
Well, we still have our canines, and so they didn't completely disappear. They just reduced in size. Yeah, so there are a number of different explanations for this. One is simply if it's not going to kill you, then it'll stick around. So if it's not taking up too much energy, if it's not something that's in the way, then it is something that is likely to still be maintained and have some echoes of its presence into more recent times. One of the other explanations is that evolution is clever and usually reuses objects. And so when we talk about vestigial structures, oftentimes they do have some function. And so there are some papers that have come out in the last decade suggesting that the appendix has a little more immune function to it. It's not completely useless, and that it serves as sort of almost a lymph organ. In addition to that, I talk about the tail, the vestigial tail, but that's where muscles that support the pelvic girdle are anchored. And so those are really important muscles that make up the pelvic floor. And if those muscles become damaged or stretched out, that can lead to prolapse and all sorts of problems. This particular problem in women. And so having that piece there for those muscles to anchor onto is pretty important. And yet, what is it made of? It's made of those tiny little nubbins that once were individual pieces in what was once a much longer tail. And so it's been sort of co-opted into this other use. David,
Jeremy, thank
yeah.
you. There's an idea that because the brain is so energy consumptive, that as a trade-off, as the brain increased in size, a lot of intestine was lost.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know intestine does not fossilize very well. Is that idea accepted?
It's debated. I love it. I think it's an elegant hypothesis that explains a number of different things that we see in the fossil record at that time. We begin to see an enlargement in brain size. It's about 2 million years ago, I'm talking about, at the origin of our own genus Homo. So you've got things like Lucy running around for millions of years. And then you start getting things a little different. Bigger brains, smaller teeth, more stone tools in the vicinity, not the invention of stone tools, but just more of them, and cut marks more frequently found on the bones of animals. And so there's the incorporation of more meat into the diet, the smashing of bone to get marrow as well. There's some evidence that cooking begins around that time, maybe a little bit after that. And the idea is, okay, just as David said, brains are energetically expensive. They take up, in an adult, they take up about 20% of your energy, even though they're 2% of your body weight. In a child, in a newborn, it's about 60% of the energy is going to the brain. And so the brain is this energetically expensive organ. Well, if you're going to increase brain size, where is that energy coming from? Okay, this is a zero-sum game here. We have to get the energy from somewhere. And the energy, as David said, was being suggested as it was a trade, an internal trade, where those individuals who had slightly larger brains, if they had slightly smaller guts, because the intestines are constantly remodeling themselves and sloughing off and growing new internal tissues, that's where that energy is coming from, smaller guts. Well, if you're eating nothing but plants, then having a smaller gut is a horrible idea. You're not going to be able to digest those plants. But carnivores have super small guts. They can digest their meat much more efficiently with those small guts. And so the idea is that these are all happening in concert with each other. Brain increase, gut reduction, a shift in diet that includes more meat, which your smaller intestinal volume can handle, but then you're cooking food or breaking it up more with your tools. And so you're not putting as much of a burden on your intestines. You're doing more digestion externally. It's something called the expensive tissue hypothesis. And yeah, David, it is, it's got some problems. People have looked at it in other animals, bats and birds, for instance, and it doesn't quite follow in other animals as well as you'd like it to have it as a good model for explaining humans. But I still think it explains a lot of what we see in the fossil record at that time.
Very good.
Arts.
Hey, hey, Jeremy, we've seen species splitting off from each other historically. Presumably, the process that's gone on for millions of years hasn't stopped.
Mm-hmm.
What does that say about the future?
Oh, I love questions about future evolution. Usually we have no idea because what we've understood about the past is that species that survive or don't survive, it depends enormously on changes to the environment and the ecological circumstances. And it's very difficult to predict what the environment's going to be like centuries from now, millennia from now. the modeling of how our climate is changing is difficult to do. And there are a lot of assumptions that go into those models. However, it does seem pretty obvious that the planet is warming, that the Arctic ice is vanishing. And so take, for instance, the polar bear. You've probably seen those videos and images of polar bears starving because they can't hunt for seals on those floes of ice anymore. But one of the things you probably haven't seen so much is that polar bears are interacting more frequently now with grizzlies, with brown bears. So bears form this really interesting biogeography around the planet. You've got the polar bears around the Arctic Circle, and then ringing the planet south of the polar bears are the brown bears, what we call grizzlies here. And then ringing the planet south of that are the black bears. So you get the American black bear, but in Asia, there's sun bear and moon bear and all sorts of bears that are found, throughout the globe. Okay, that interface between the polar bear and the grizzly bear is breaking down, and grizzly bears are moving north and beginning to encroach on polar bear territory because they have nowhere to go. They can't go further north because there's no further north, and they're interbreeding with them. So you're getting hybrids. And what's really fascinating about that is that back in the Pleistocene, prior to the last ice age, they were a single species. And then they diversified as a result of the ice ages and this new habitat being created in the Arctic. And now you've got this giant white bear that's specialized eating on seals, and the brown bear moves south. And so you got speciation that occurs, but they can still interbreed. And people have known they could interbreed in zoos. They can still produce fertile offspring, and it's happening again. And so they're likely to just be reabsorbed into the brown bear population. And to me, it's a really good model for what happened with Neanderthals. That Neanderthals moved into Europe. They specialized in sort of tundra Arctic type behaviors. And then when they met back up with Homo sapiens, we interbred with them. We reabsorbed them into our gene pool. And so there was a split and then a reemerging. Life is dynamic and fascinating and complicated. And I think that's likely what's going to happen with the polar bear. And so will the polar bear go extinct? Yes. But will its genes be gone? No. They'll be reabsorbed into the brown bear. So Neanderthals went extinct. They're gone. You can't find any of these anymore. But in all of our genomes, we have collectively a Neanderthal genome.
Okay. Gee, Jeremy, thanks again. I think with that, we'll move on to the next phase. And again, thank you so much. It was a great presentation.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you for your questions. Yep.
Feel free. Art has my email, so feel free to be in touch if anyone has questions that they didn't get a chance to ask.
Really fascinating. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Everyone. Take care.
Yep. Next, I'd like to talk just a little bit about, well, first of all, Morris, would you like to tell us about our next month's speaker, please?
Sure, Joe. Our guest speaker next time will be Tom Mannion, President and the CEO of New London Hospital. He will join us to talk about the developments underway with the hospital and what its plans are for the future. And I'm pleased to say that a friend of Tom's, Bill Helm, will introduce him.
Great. Well, we'll be looking forward to that in our in-person meeting, which brings us to at least one of my final comments. So I met again yesterday with the folks at Forbes Tavern, and I'll go over where we stand. And at our next meeting, which will be the 12th, I think I wrote down, will be held at the Draper Room on at Eastman. It is, from our perspective, fully vaccinated people. Since we have a kind of a vulnerable group, it was to be expected that those attend in person to be fully vaccinated. It also recommends that when we show up, that we do elbow bumps instead of handshakes. Use your discretion. There is no longer a mask mandate there. The meals will be buffet style for at least a number of our first few meetings. I suspect that these first, our meetings in person there will not be like we were used to in the past, plated dinners, et cetera, et cetera. We're gonna have to be willing to work with these folks a little bit more because they do have some other issues, which I'll talk about. For example, there's been some issues with the truck transportation getting the food there. So what this is gonna mean for us, instead of, we used to be able to sign up Monday, maybe Tuesday at the latest, we're gonna have to sign up for the meeting the Friday before the Thursday meeting. Because they have to make sure they can get the food, accommodations, and transportation to get everything there. And the reason it's gonna be buffet, obviously, it's still shortage of staff, like everybody's experiencing. So the dress will be the business casual. I think we'll try that a few times instead of getting back to formal sport coats right away. At least that's my opinion. And I think I suspect there'll be some rough edges as we go through here. If, for example, someone's in attendance and they may have trouble getting through the buffet line, I hope another fellow squire will do that for them, bring a plate to them, and then they can cut the line. We'll work that out. So everything else should be pretty much as we've had it in the past. And I know for myself, I'm really looking forward to meeting it, seeing everybody and greeting everybody again in person. And I hope you are too. And finally, I'd like to, since this is probably our last Zoom meeting, like to thank again, these things would not have been possible at all without Morris Edwards and Art Rosen's fine lineup of speakers. I have been extremely impressed, and I'm sure you all have as well. Our Bill Helm has taken secretary has taken the minutes, and they've been recorded, just as if we were meeting in person. Tom Bellis, our treasurer, with backup from Jim Lyons. John's been doing an awful lot behind the scenes with regards to the upgrading of our bylaws, et cetera, all the forms he sends out to everybody to fill. And that's been working very smoothly. Tom Knoll, our webmaster, who's the gentleman who sends out these notifications to you all. And Mark Friedman and Peter Rucci, our membership committee, who has been working hard to try to increase our membership, and Gary Keene, our VP. I'd like to thank all of you folks because without you, this wouldn't have been possible. So thanks again. And I can't wait to see you all in person, August 8th at the Forbes Tavern next month. With that, I'll adjourn unless there's anybody else that has any other business. Okay, well, we will see you all in person in August, I hope. And you'll be getting notified just like you did before from the webmaster saying how many in your party, et cetera, et cetera. So see you all then.
Great.
Thank you,
Thanks
Joe.
again. Great job, Joe.
Thank you.
Good job.
Goodbye.
Bye.